If you're looking to add birds or animals to your slow stitching projects, you've come to the right place. I'm going to show 4 different methods to use templates to add animals directly onto your project. We'll make use of negative space to make silhouettes, use ink, and even use recycled threads as stuffing to make a bird extra plump. I will also show 2 different ways to create a border. One that's borrowed from the quilting world. I'll be using miniature templates today, but these techniques work no matter the size of your bird or animal. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. I'm going to be using 4 pieces of felt, each about 2 inches square. And for each piece of felt, I'm going to cut 1 piece of fabric that's bigger on all sides by about 1/4 inch. I'm going to be turning these into brooches, so I also have some safety pins to stitch on the back when I'm finished. I'm starting with this bird shape, and it comes from my mini animal tracing template set. I'm going to be using pieces from that set today. I'll put a link in the description in case you want to pick up a set of your own. I'm going to be using the same tracing method for all 4 pieces I'll be working on today. I'm bringing out my friction erasable pen, and I'm simply tracing the template. Now, depending on the fabric, you may be able to smoothly glide your pen, or you may have to use a dotting motion. So I've traced this bird right in the center of my piece, and I'm ready to start stitching. And I'm going to do the same thing here with this other bird, this bird in flight. And I'm thinking today that it's going to be a dove. Placing it in the center of my piece of fabric and tracing around it. With these 2 pieces, having traced my bird, now I'm going to stitch the outline. And because they're so small, I'm going to make sure that I go right on the inside of my tracing lines. This isn't as necessary if you're using a larger template. So here I have stitched 1 bird using black thread and 1 using white thread. I've used 1 strand of embroidery floss to stitch these shapes. Now I'm going to demonstrate what I'm calling the ink in method. I have a jelly roll pen in black. This jelly roll pen is permanent. Not all jelly roll pens are permanent. It seems to be that the ones that are in pastel colors tend not to be permanent. And I have a set that are solid colors, black, I have a red, I have a brown, I have a dark blue, and these ones are all permanent, and it says that on the package when you pick them up. So these are the ones I'm going to use today, and I'm going to start with my black, and I'm going to color in this bird. So what this is going to do is, when I'm stitching, I'm not going to be fighting with this deep fuchsia background here. When I'm stitching with my black threads, the background's going to be black. So I take my time to spread this ink around and get it in all the spots. One of the things I like about the jelly roll pen is it doesn't wick into the other areas of the fabric. For the most part, it stays exactly where you put it down and doesn't spread. And I'm coming in with my red pen and making some marks on the wing. I'm going to make this a red winged blackbird. It's not as necessary here because the color is so close. Now I'm going to heat set this ink. That's also going to erase any lines from my friction pen. So now I have my bird where the outline is stitched in black. It's filled in with this ink, and I can stitch on top of it with black. Since I've cut my fabric slightly larger than my felt, I'm going to be able to do some blanket stitching and fold over the edges of my fabric as I stitch. So I've begun here. You can iron the edges over, or you can just fold them. So I'm holding down the fabric with my finger. I'm also holding that thread in my left hand while I stitch with my right, and that's helping me to create the loop of the blanket stitch. So this is going to create a border on my piece, and it's also going to tuck under all of my edges. So here's my dove with my first round of blanket stitching in this teal color. It's created a nice frame and tucked under the raw edges. And here's my red-winged blackbird. I've stitched in black. Doesn't show up as well, I think, on camera, but having that black ink in the background has really helped me to create the look that I want. And I'm going to do the blanket stitching like I did on the dove piece on this piece too. So here it is with one round of blanket stitching in black, and that has folded all of my edges over and under. And that's one way to clean up your edges. So here are both my pieces. I'm really liking the way that this red-winged blackbird looks without any stitching in the background. It's just standing out. It's very bold. So I'm going to leave that as is, and I'm going to turn to my dove piece, and I want to add some stitching in the background. I was thinking that French knots would be a nice background here, but because it's so small, I'm going to do something a little bit different. An alternative to a French knot is to make a small stitch, and I'm going to go around the background and spread them out the same way I would with French knots. This is a less textural, smaller mark. Now I'm going to come in with a color that's slightly darker, and I'm going to stitch in the lower half of the piece. I'm going to create these same stitches. I'm going to put them closer together. So here it is filled in the background. It's very subtle. It's adding some texture and a hint of color. Now I'm coming back in and adding more blanket stitching around the edges. I'm going to add it in both colors, both the teal and the black. I've also outlined my dove in black. This isn't necessary, but I thought it would make the bird stand out and add some dimension. For my next two pieces, I'm going to use the binding method to attach the fabric to my felt. So I have this bright blue fabric, and I've chosen some embroidery floss that matches very closely with it. And I'm going to cut out a piece of fabric. I'm going to leave about 1/4 of an inch around the edges on all the sides. So this binding method is the same method that some quilters use when they use their backing as their binding on their quilt. So I tie a knot in the end of my floss. I'm using 2 strands, and I'm going to fold over the edges, and I'm going to use a running stitch to stitch all the way to the edge. And when I get to the edge, I'm going to fold those corners in to make a mitered corner. And the way you fold the corners is similar to the way that you would fold when you're wrapping a present. And once I've folded up that corner, I stitch it down. I go as far out to the edge as I need to make that nice point, and then I continue along towards the other edge. It may be helpful here to use some binding clips to keep everything in place. It makes it easier to do the running stitch when that clip is holding down the fabric. And I remove the clip when I get to the edge, and then I do my fold. I fold in the corner and then fold it up, just like wrapping a present. And then I stitch that corner down, take 1 or 2 stitches right in that corner, and then continue along with my running stitch. And I do my very last corner, stitch that down, and then continue with my running stitch back to the place where I started. It looks good, and now I'm going to knot off. Now I'm going to bring in this bunny template and my friction pen and trace it just like I did on the other pieces. There's some really small spaces in here in tracing this bunny. So I'm using a friction pen that has quite a fine point. You can see here with the 2 types of pens that I have, one is 0.7 and one is 0.5, that it does make a difference to have that smaller point, that 5, to get in all those areas. I'm going to do the same thing here. Because it's so small, I'm going to stitch just inside the lines that I traced. I'm going to use white for that. So here it is. I've traced my bunny, and I really like the way that this looks as is, and I'm tempted to not add any stitching and just leave it alone, just like I did with the red-winged blackbird. And because I've used this binding method, that's an option here. But I'm going to add some more stitching, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But first I'm going to show the 4th method, which is making use of negative space. So I have this floral fabric, and I'm looking for a part of the design that I think would look nice as the body of the bird. So here's a spot I found with some pink flowers. So this is the part that I'm not going to stitch over, that's going to be seen as is. So this bird's going to have these flowers on its body. And then I've used my friction pen to trace out the size of my felt, drawn a square here. And now I'm going to cut that piece out just outside of those lines that I've drawn, about 1/4 inch all the way around, because I'm going to use the binding method on this piece as well. Now this piece of fabric, the place that I chose for my bird meant that there's one corner on the lower right hand side that doesn't quite have enough fabric. But because I'm going to be using this binding method, it's going to be okay, it's going to fit. So I have stitched around the back, I've made my miter corners, and this piece is ready for me to add some stitching to it. So I have my bird shape there. I'm going to stitch around that bird. I'm going to use a blue color. Here's the color I used. I've stitched around this bird. And now I'm going to come in. Now this is something I've done with all my pieces. When I have finished stitching around them, I need to remove those lines that I made. So I'm bringing in my mini iron and erasing those lines I made with the friction pen. So now I'm ready to stitch on this bird piece. So the first thing I've done is added some blanket stitching around the edges. This time I didn't need to fold my corners down because I've already used the binding method. And I've done 1 round of stitching. I've used the same color that I used to trace the bird. I also gave the bird an eye by making a little French knot. So now what I want to do is stitch in the background of this bird to try and minimize that pattern so that the flowers that are in the body of the bird will be the focal point and not the background. So now I've stitched in the background of this bird, and I have another idea to make the body of the bird really pop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add recycled thread ends, and I'm going to stuff them inside. So I've taken a piece of felt and I've stitched it on 3 sides on the back, and now I'm going to bring out my thread ends. Well, these are ends of thread that accumulate when you're stitching. They're too short to rethread onto the needle. So these are my thread orts. I'm going to pull out some pieces of thread. I'm going to stuff them, try and place them right in the middle where that bird is. I'm going to take my time to get them all bunched up. Take another small amount, push them in, taking care not to push it all the way to the top because I want this all to be right in the middle where the bird is. And then when I have everything in place, and I think it's enough at that point, so I feel like I have enough thread in there, so I'm going to stitch down around this bird to encase those threads. And it's going to help puff up the bird even more to stitch this down. So I've chosen an off-white thread and 1 strand. I'm going to come in from the back and I'm going to bring that thread to the front. I'm going to take very small stitches on the front, so they're not going to be seen. I'm going to go inside the edge of the bird. So I'm going inside where I previously stitched the outline, very, very close to that line, all the way around the bird. So I'm taking very small stitches on the front, and then I'm moving ahead maybe about 1/4 inch on the back and taking another small stitch. So now I've gone all the way around, and that's really made that bird puffy. I'm liking the way that that looks, so I'm going to knot off. And then I have my fat puffy bird. So for this piece, I've added that dimension of the puffiness for the bird, and then I've done heavy stitching in the background in both green and purpley blue shades. And what that stitching has done is muted the background and made the floral pattern that's on the bird really stand out. I've stitched a pin onto the back of this bird, so now it's a wearable piece of art. Now my last piece is the bunny, and here I've come in with white and I've made running stitches in the background. I've done 3 different types of running stitches. In the bottom, it's closer together, and in the middle, a little farther apart, and then in the top, I've gone in the other direction. The simplicity of the stitching behind the bunny is really nice, so I could stop here. The other option is to add 1 or 2 more colors. So I've chosen this golden yellow color, and I've gone around the edges of the bunny shape, and I've added some blanket stitching on the corners. This is a subtle addition, and I think what it does is highlights the bunny shape even more. I've added a pin onto the back of this bunny as well, so now it is also a piece of wearable art. For detailed instructions on attaching the backing and the pin, you can see my previous video where I made some brooches. But just to recap, I choose a piece of felt. I cut it slightly smaller than my piece. I clip the corners so they aren't sticking out. I stitch it on, and then I add the pin. I hope these techniques have given you some ideas for your own projects. There's so many options when it comes to using templates, and these are just a few. If you really like using the miniature templates, please check out my video series where I make a slow stitch scroll. It's a larger project that uses the mini templates, and it lends itself to so many options and creativity. Thank you so much for joining me today. Until next time, happy stitching.